Get your worthless things and get out of my house, Mark snarled, shoving a suitcase towards his wife, Sarah. He adjusted the collar on his expensive shirt, a recent promotion celebrating his rise at the company. I'm marrying Jessica, a real woman. You're just a leech I've been carrying. He sneered, completely unaware that the leech he was kicking out was the secret, silent billionaire who owned the very company he was so proud of. Sarah stood by the door, her face pale, but her eyes held a cold fire he mistook for tears. He thought he was securing his future. He had no idea she was about to sign the papers that would not only crush his career, but leave him without a single cent to his name. Utterly homeless. Sarah's hand tightened on the handle of the cheap worn suitcase. It was the one she'd brought into this marriage 8 years ago. Mark had always promised to buy her a new expensive set, but somehow he never got around to it. Now she was glad. It was a fitting bookend. He saw her glance at the walls of the grand foyer, walls he assumed she was weeping to leave. He laughed, a short barking sound. Don't bother, he said. Jessica is bringing in a decorator on Monday. She hates your bland, boring taste. Frankly, so do I. Bland, boring, a leech. The words echoed in the marble hall, a hall she had paid for with a quiet transfer from an account he didn't know existed. She thought back to their beginning. He hadn't been like this. He had been a low-level analyst at Starkweather Holdings, kind, unassuming, and seemingly uninterested in the corporate climb. That was why she'd chosen him. After her father, the Titan Robert Starkweather, had passed away, Sarah had been suffocated by a parade of gold-digging suitors, men who could smell her inheritance like sharks smell blood. Mark had been her refuge. He'd loved her, he said, for her simple heart, not for a fortune she never told him she had. She had wanted to be just Sarah, not Sarah Starkweather, heiress to the empire. Her father had warned her on his deathbed, his voice a papery rasp. Power is a heavy coat, sweetheart. Be careful who you let carry it for you. Marry for love, but sign the papers for war. She had signed the papers, a prenuptial agreement so ironclad it was practically a fortress. Mark had laughed as he signed it, barely reading. What's this, Sarah? All assets held prior to the marriage remain separate? Honey, all I have is student debt and a leased Honda. You can keep it. He didn't know her prior assets included 51% of the entire Starkweather conglomerate. She had kept her secret, relishing the simple life. She'd managed her empire from a quiet home office he thought was for her little crafting blog, signing off on billion-dollar acquisitions before going downstairs to make him dinner. All her proxies and board members communicated through her family's ancient lawyer, Arthur Harrison. To the world and to her husband, she was a ghost. But as Mark's career at her company grew, so did his ego. She had greased the wheels for him, subtly, arranging for his good work to land on the right desks, believing she was supporting her husband's dreams. Instead, she had been feeding a monster. The recent promotion he was so proud of, she had personally signed off on it, an anniversary gift. He was celebrating it by replacing her. Are you deaf? Mark snapped, pulling her from her reverie. I said, get out. Sarah's eyes moved from his face, past the swirling staircase, and landed on a small, insignificant painting hanging by the door. It was a simple watercolor of a gray coastline. I'll be taking that, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Mark actually scoffed. That ugly thing? My God, you have no taste. Jessica loves modern art. Big, bold pieces. Not that drab little sketch. Fine. Take it. A fitting reminder of the mousy, colorless woman you are. He ripped it from the wall, the drywall tearing slightly, and shoved it into her hands. He didn't know it was a key. It wasn't a masterpiece, but the back of the frame held the private keys to her entire crypto ledger and the direct, untraceable passcodes to her private servers. It was quite literally the keys to the kingdom. She tucked it under her arm, picked up her suitcase, and walked out the door without a backward glance. She didn't look at the shimmering black car parked down the street, where she could just see the outline of a woman with bright blonde hair. Sarah walked past the gates, pulled out her phone, and pressed a single number on her contact list. Arthur, she said, her voice no longer pale but forged from steel. He's out. Execute the fidelity clause. Freeze everything. The joint accounts, the credit cards, all of it. And the house. I want it on the market by noon. And call an emergency meeting of the board for 9 a.m. tomorrow. It's time I came home. Mark woke the next morning feeling lighter than he had in years. The house was blissfully silent. No sign of Sarah's mopey presence. Jessica was already there, twirling in the kitchen in one of his dress shirts, sipping coffee from a mug that said, "World's Best Husband." "It's perfect, baby," she cooed. "We can finally be happy. No more hiding. No more pretending you're married to that beige woman." Mark grinned, pulling her close. "Beige. That's the perfect word for her. She was a leech, Jess, sucking the life out of me. But now I'm free. I'm a VP. You and I, we're going to the top." He felt a rush of power. He was the new VP of acquisitions, a role he'd earned through sheer grit and brilliance. Or so he thought. He'd crushed his rivals, his presentations had been flawless, and the CEO, a stiff old suit named Peterson, had finally recognized his talent. Today he would walk into Starkweather Holdings, not just as an employee, but as a king. He kissed Jessica, who was already pointing at the curtains. "Those have to go. I want velvet." Mark laughed. "Whatever you want, baby. The new salary can handle it." He practically strutted into the gleaming glass tower of the Starkweather building. People seemed to be looking at him, whispering. He mistook their nervous energy for awe. "Morning, Janet," he boomed at the receptionist. "Mr. Jennings," she said, her voice strained, not meeting his eyes. "There's an all-hands emergency meeting in the main boardroom. In 5 minutes." Mark's grin widened. An emergency meeting? On the day after his promotion? They were probably announcing it to the whole company, maybe even giving him a bigger bonus. He pictured the applause. He adjusted his tie, a silk monstrosity Jessica had picked out. He remembered briefly how Sarah used to straighten his ties, her small, cool hands so gentle. He shook the thought away. That was the past. The future was bright, bold, and blonde. He strode into the boardroom. The atmosphere was not celebratory. It was a morgue. The entire executive board, including the ancient, formidable Arthur Harrison, the company's chief legal counsel and chairman of the board, were seated. Even CEO Peterson looked green. Mark's confidence wavered for a second. Morning, everyone. What's the occasion?" Arthur Harrison, a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite, stared at him. "Sit down, Mr. Jennings." The Mr. Jennings felt wrong. It wasn't Mark, my boy. It was Mr. Jennings, like he was a stranger. He sat, his palms suddenly clammy. "We are here," Harrison began, his voice filling the room, "to address a catastrophic failure in leadership, a breach of ethics that cuts to the very core of this company." Mark's mind raced. Was it his rival, Henderson? Did they find out Henderson was fudging the numbers? He almost smiled. "Starkweather Holdings has a zero-tolerance policy for conflicts of interest," Harrison continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "We do not tolerate executives leveraging company positions for personal gain, nor do we tolerate fraternization with subordinates." Mark's blood turned to ice. Jessica. She was technically a marketing manager, 2 levels below him. But everyone did it. It wasn't a fireable offense. Not for a VP. "Arthur," Mark started, trying a familiar tone, "if this is about Jessica Lang, it's a simple misunderstanding. It's a private matter." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "It became a company matter, Mr. Jennings, when you used your corporate card, a card funded by this company, to purchase her a vehicle, and an apartment, and numerous other gifts, all while married to a woman who, for 8 years, has embodied the very humility and integrity this company was founded on." Mark was stunned. How could they know? He'd hidden those expenses. "But that is not the primary reason for this meeting," Harrison said, his voice dropping. "For 8 years, the majority shareholder of Starkweather Holdings has remained anonymous, content to manage her assets from afar, trusting her executive team to run the day-to-day operations." He paused. The room was so quiet Mark could hear his own heart pounding. "She has decided, given recent and personal events, that this company requires a more hands-on approach. Gentlemen, ladies, allow me to introduce the owner of Starkweather Holdings, and your new acting CEO, Miss Sarah Starkweather." The side door to the boardroom opened, and Sarah walked in. But it wasn't Sarah. It couldn't be. The woman he'd kicked out yesterday wore cheap jeans and a faded t-shirt. This woman was in a bespoke, razor-sharp black suit that probably cost more than his car. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant, severe chignon. Her face was the same, but the look in her eyes. It was the same cold fire he'd seen by the door, but now it was an inferno of pure Arctic authority. She didn't look at him. She walked to the head of the table and took the seat beside Harrison. The entire board rose as one. "Ms. Starkweather," CEO Peterson said, bowing his head slightly. "Sarah," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. What is this? What are you doing here?" She finally turned her head, her gaze pinning him to his chair. It was like being inspected by a god. "I'm here to take out the trash, Mark," she said, her voice quiet, yet it sliced through the silence. The board flinched. Mark's world was tilting. It wasn't possible. This mousy, boring, beige woman. You own Starkweather?" he stammered. You're my boss?" Sarah gave a small, chilling smile. "I'm not your boss, Mark. You don't work here anymore." He looked at her, bewildered, and then at Harrison. "What? You can't be serious. I just got the VP promotion. I'm the best acquisitions man you have." Harrison slid a single file across the table. "You were promoted, Mr. Jennings, at the express request of Ms. Starkweather. It was an anniversary gift, I believe." The blood drained from Mark's face. All of it. His promotions, his bonuses, the easy ride. It hadn't been his brilliance. It had been her. A handout, a charity case. The leech had been the host all along. "This is a mistake," Mark pleaded, his voice rising to a desperate squeak. He looked at Sarah, truly looked at her, and saw his entire marriage flash before his eyes. Her boring nights spent reading financial reports. Her coincidental run-ins with board members at charity events he dragged her to. Her quiet, offhand comments about the market that always turned out to be right. "Sarah, honey, we can talk about this. Last night was a mistake. I was stressed. I didn't mean it." Sarah held up a hand. He stopped talking instantly. The power in that simple gesture was absolute. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice bored, "please proceed with the termination." Harrison nodded grimly. "Mark Jennings, you are terminated for cause, effective immediately, for gross misconduct in violation of the corporate ethics clause. Furthermore, Ms. Starkweather has activated the fidelity and conduct clauses in your prenuptial agreement." Mark's mind scrambled back to that day, signing the papers. He'd laughed. "Due to your proven infidelity," Harrison read in a monotone, "you forfeit any and all claims to marital assets, community property, and spousal support. As all major assets, including your home and vehicles, were purchased solely by Ms. Starkweather's prior held assets, you are entitled to precisely nothing." Nothing. The word hung in the air. "But the joint accounts," Mark cried. "My salary, my savings." Sarah spoke again. "Your savings, Mark. The joint accounts were a convenience I funded. Your salary was routed there, yes, but your withdrawals far exceeded your contributions. You've been living on my money for 8 years. You just called it your salary. As of last night, those accounts are closed to you." A woman from HR, flanked by 2 stone-faced security guards, entered the room. "Mr. Jennings, we'll need your ID badge, your company car keys, and your corporate phone." Mark was shaking, his face a mask of purple rage and stark terror. You bitch," he spat at Sarah. "You're a fucking leech." The security guards grabbed his arms. Sarah just watched him, her expression unreadable. "A leech, Mark," she said, her voice soft. "A leech feeds on a host to survive. You, however, seem to have poisoned the host and are now surprised you have nothing left to eat. Get him out of my building." The last thing Mark saw as he was dragged out, his heels scraping on the Italian marble, was Sarah turning to the board. "Now, gentlemen, let's talk about Q4 projections. I see some inefficiencies I plan to correct." The humiliation of the lobby was a fresh hell. He was marched past hundreds of employees, all staring, all filming on their phones. The man who had entered like a king was being hauled out like a criminal. Once on the street, the guards literally threw his cheap office plant box at his feet, the contents spilling onto the grimy sidewalk. "Don't come back," one of them growled. Mark stood there, shaking in his expensive suit. He tried to call Jessica. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." She'd blocked him. Of course, she must have gotten the call from HR at the same time. He tried to use his credit card to get a cab. Declined. He tried another. Declined. And the next. Declined. He checked his personal bank account on his phone, the one he thought she couldn't touch. A balance of $43.12. He stumbled to the subway, a rage building in his chest. She couldn't take the house. It was in both their names. He'd made sure of that. He'd get a lawyer. He would, what? He arrived at the manicured lawn of their suburban mansion. It was a 2-hour trip on public transport, a journey he hadn't made in years. He was met not with an empty driveway, but with a nightmare. A large, garish "for sale" sign was hammered into the lawn. A high-end realtor he didn't recognize was showing the porch to a smiling couple. "Excuse me," Mark yelled, running up the walkway. "What the hell is this? This is my house." The realtor, a woman with a painted-on smile, held up a perfectly manicured hand. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private showing." "Private? I live here. Get off my property." The realtor's smile didn't waver. "According to the deed I have on file, this property is solely owned by the Starkweather Family Trust. Your name, Mr. Jennings, doesn't appear on it. Now please leave before I call the police." He'd been so arrogant, so sure of his community property lie, he'd never even checked the final deed. She'd played him from the very beginning. Defeated, he went to the only other place he could, Jessica's apartment, the one he'd been paying for. When he arrived, the door was ajar, and the sounds of frantic packing came from within. "Jess!" he cried, bursting in. She whirled around, her face stained with tears and rage. "You!" she shrieked. "You ruined me!" She threw a stiletto at his head. He ducked. "They fired me. They took my company car. They're auditing my expenses, all because of you." Mark was baffled. "Me? This was Sarah. She's the owner. She owns everything." Jessica let out a hysterical laugh. "And you didn't know? You idiot! I hitched my wagon to a dead horse. I thought you were a lion, Mark, a VP, a real man. But you're nothing. You're just a plaything, a pet she got tired of. Well, I'm not going down with you. Get out." She shoved him into the hallway and slammed the door, the deadbolt clicking shut. For 2 days, Mark slept on the subway, his suit wrinkled and stained. He'd sold his $2,000 watch for $150 to buy food. He was a ghost, invisible to the city he thought he was about to conquer. His phone on its last bar of battery buzzed. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. It was a single image. It was the small, ugly watercolor of the gray coastline. It was now hanging on a vast, minimalist wall in a stunning penthouse office. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind it, the entire city skyline glittered. He recognized the view. It was the CEO's private office, the one no one, not even Peterson, had ever been allowed into. The painting, the one he'd called drab and tasteless, was the only thing adorning the wall. It was her prize. A second text came through. It was from Sarah. "I forgot to thank you, Mark. By kicking me out, you reminded me who I am. I was happy being a wife, but I was born to be a Starkweather. P.S. The leech just acquired the bank that holds all your personal loans from before we were married. They're due. All of them. Now." The phone died. Mark sank onto the cold park bench, the notification of his impending total bankruptcy glowing in his mind. He was fired. He was homeless. He was penniless. And he was in debt to her. The woman he'd called a useless leech had just proven she owned the entire ocean. He lowered his head into his hands, a hollow, broken man, as the cold night fell on the city she owned. 6 months later, the city was deep in the grip of an unforgiving winter. The man huddled in the line that snaked around the St. Jude's soup kitchen was unrecognizable as the proud VP who had once strode into the Starkweather Tower. His expensive suit was long gone, sold for a week's worth of food. He now wore a threadbare coat he'd found in a shelter donation bin, thin and useless against the biting wind. Mark Jennings was gaunt, his face covered in a patchy, unkempt beard, his eyes dull and hollow. He tried to find work, but the story of his firing and the subsequent lawsuits for his debts had made him toxic. No one would hire a man blacklisted by Sarah Starkweather. He'd heard what happened to Jessica. After being fired and sued by Starkweather Holdings for misuse of company funds, she'd declared bankruptcy. The last he'd heard, she was waitressing 2 towns over, living with her parents, her bright, bold future reduced to serving coffee. He almost envied her. As he shuffled forward, clutching his paper ticket, his gaze drifted up to the massive electronic ticker, scrolling across the building opposite the soup kitchen. He couldn't escape her. There, 10 feet high, was her face. The headline read, "Starkweather Shakeup a Success. CEO Sarah Starkweather named Business Leader of the Year after record Q4 profits." He watched as the digital image of her smiled, confident and serene, before it switched to an ad for a new car he could never dream of affording. He felt a familiar, sour bile rise in his throat. He had called her a leech. He had been the one sucking the life from her, and he hadn't even known it. He was the parasite, and she had finally and calmly burned him off. The line moved. He took his plastic bowl of watery soup and found a spot on the curb, invisible to the world. Miles above him in the CEO's penthouse office, Sarah Starkweather stood not by the window, but in front of the small, drab watercolor of the gray coastline. It was the only piece of art in the vast, minimalist room. Her chief counsel, Arthur Harrison, stood beside her. "The board has unanimously approved your green energy initiative, Ms. Starkweather," Arthur said, a rare hint of warmth in his voice. "Peterson and his team tried to table it for years. You got it passed in 2 months." "Peterson was a placeholder, Arthur. He was afraid to make waves," Sarah replied, her eyes on the painting. "You can't own an ocean and be afraid to make waves." "Indeed," Arthur said, "and the last of Mr. Jennings' defaulted assets have been seized. His debts are settled. He has nothing." Sarah was silent for a moment. She reached out and brushed an imaginary speck of dust from the painting's simple frame. She thought of the man who had ripped it from the wall, the man who had called her a useless leech, a failure, a beige woman. He had been so wrong. She wasn't the leech. She was the host, and she had finally stopped letting the parasite drain her. "Good," she said, her voice clear and steady. She turned away from the painting, her past, and faced the glittering city skyline that spread out before her like a map of her future. "Send in the acquisitions team, Arthur. It's time to expand.